Donald Trump has the worst lawyers that any president under investigation has ever had. That is just fact. The reason he has these lawyers is that he is indeed under investigation. Let's make no mistake about that. The new front runner for the title of worst lawyer to ever defend a president under investigation is Jay Sekulow, whose mission yesterday was to go on the Sunday shows and say the president is not under investigation. Now, this was going to be difficult because the president had already said twice that he is under investigation. And then, of course, Sekulow himself said twice to Chris Wallace that the president is under investigation before he changed that to the president is not under investigation. And when Chris Wallace called him on that, Jay Sekulow got indignant about Chris Wallace putting words in his mouth.
Chris, let me be clear. You asked me a question about what the president's tweet was regarding the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. That's what you asked me. And I responded to what that legal theory would be. So I do not appreciate you putting words in my mouth when I've been crystal clear that the president is not and has not been under investigation.
Do not appreciate putting words in my mouth. Okay, so here are the words that Chris Wallace did not put in Jay Sekulow's mouth.
And now he's being investigated. So he's being investigated.
It was going to be very hard for Jay Sekulow to outdo Donald Trump's New York lawyer, Mark Kasowitz, who got basic facts wrong in his first public statement in defense of the president when he claimed that James Comey's testimony was total vindication of President Trump. Mark Kasowitz defended Donald Trump on the losing side of the Trump University fraud case, in which Donald Trump was forced to pay $25 million to the students he defrauded at Trump University, a university whose very name was a fraud, because, of course, it was not a university. Mark Kasowitz also led Donald Trump on some of his most ridiculous, most frivolous, most impossible lawsuits, including suing Bill Maher and suing Tim O'Brien, who wrote a book about Donald Trump. Mark Kasowitz and Donald Trump not only lost that lawsuit against Tim O'Brien, but in the process, Donald Trump was forced to give an under oath deposition in which he was caught in lies 30 times. And that deposition now lives after that lawsuit. And who can forget Donald Trump's in-house lawyer at Trump Tower, Michael Cohen, who contributed this moment to the presidential campaign. He's the one who said, "You can't rape your spouse. It is true, you cannot rape your spouse. And there's very clear case law." Michael Cohen has now had to hire his own lawyer because of his contacts with Russians, if any, during the campaign, are also being investigated. The only Trump lawyer who has not yet publicly humiliated himself in defense of the president is the only one who has not spoken publicly in defense of the president. That is John Dowd. It may be that the only way for a lawyer to avoid public humiliation in defense of President Trump is to simply remain silent. Meanwhile, Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller, himself a former FBI director with impeccable legal credentials, has hired 13 lawyers, all with experience in criminal cases, including investigations of the mafia, Al-Qaeda, and President Richard Nixon. A spokesman for the special prosecutor's office has told Politico that Robert Mueller plans to hire several more attorneys. And so, as of tonight, the investigation of the president pits Robert Mueller's dream team against Donald Trump's nightmare team. Robert Mueller's dream team of prosecutors against Donald Trump's nightmare team of lawyers who no other president under investigation would ever consider hiring under any circumstances. The president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is not as reckless as the president in his choice of Washington criminal defense lawyers. Jared Kushner was the first member of the Trump team to hire a criminal defense lawyer last year during the transition. He's now reportedly considering hiring another high-powered Washington criminal defense lawyer, Abbe Lowell. Abbe Lowell has spent decades as a high-profile Washington defense lawyer, representing former Senator John Edwards, former Speaker of the House Jim Wright, former Chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee Dan Rostenkowski, and lobbyist Jack Abramoff. Abbe Lowell has experience in impeachment proceedings, having served as counsel to House Democrats during the impeachment of President Bill Clinton. Abbe Lowell is exactly the kind of lawyer that Donald Trump needs and does not have? We don't know if it was Jared Kushner's lawyers who advised him to finally speak today, to finally let his voice be publicly heard by the American people, the people he is supposed to be serving in his White House position of completely inexperienced jack of all trades to the most inexperienced president in history.
Before I came to Washington, many warned me that the bureaucracy would resist any change that we tried to implement. So far, I have found exactly the opposite.
Inspiring just to hear that voice. Jared Kushner did not say anything about how cooperative the federal courts have been. That is perhaps because federal judges all over the country have blocked the Muslim ban that Jared Kushner and the president have so eagerly tried to impose. And Jared Kushner said nothing about how cooperative the Congress has been, since it has passed exactly none of the Trump-Kushner legislative agenda, including Jared Kushner and his wife's dream of ripping health insurance away from 23 million people who will no longer be able to afford it if the Trump-Kushner health care bill ever becomes law.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.